All right, everybody. Well, welcome to the second episode of our Soundbites podcast. I'm really excited about this episode because not only is this person one of the smartest people I know, she happens to be my best friend. So I'm very lucky that she agreed to take the time out of her day to join us. Ashlee Gerow, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Hi, guys.
Hey, how are
Ashley is
you?
this. Hey, so Ashley is the senior manager of employer brand at Hubspot, and I think you're the perfect guest to, not only chat about your marketing background, but also your role as an employer brand manager and how you're leveraging data and AI to really help promote the companies that you work for. So
Sure.
thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
So for the people that aren't lucky enough to know you yet, why don't you talk about the path that got you here and where you've been?
Sure. Yeah. So the first 10 years or so of my career, I spent in the agency world. So I started in client service. I did that for a few years. And then I transitioned into more brand strategy roles. And I kind of ended my agency career leading brand strategy for a small to mid-sized B2B agency. So the bulk of my experience in the agency world was B2B. And then I kind of decided I was done with the agency grind and I wanted to go in-house and really go deep on a brand rather than kind of touching about 9 at a time. So I went into a large enterprise tech company, an employer brand, which to be honest was an area I had never even heard of before. I didn't even know it was a thing that existed. But it kind of married my marketing and brand strategy experience with an area I've always been super interested in, which is the people side of business. And it was kind of a good cross section of those two things. And I really loved it. And I've been doing that for, 3 or 4 years. And so that's where I'm at now. It's a really great combination of all the different things I've done before.
And so we've talked about, employer brand being a relatively new field. So for folks who just think it's recruiting or just think it's, internal comms, why don't you tell us a little bit about what employer brand is?
Sure. Yeah, it is a relatively new field. I would say you'll be hard pressed to find somebody who has more than like 8 to 10 years experience specifically in employer brand. You'll hear it called talent brand. You'll hear a lot of people call it recruitment marketing. And those are certainly parts of employer brand. But the easiest way to talk about it and kind of what I tell people in one sentence is it is our job to market a company as a great place to work to candidates. There's a lot of nuance in that, but that's the simplest way to describe it.
How is it different from marketing a product or a service? Are there different considerations you have to think of when you're targeting someone I want to work here? I have to brand the company a certain way versus trying to go after end customers?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and it's honestly one of the biggest mind shifts I had to make when I started working in employer brand because I don't think it's as straightforward. It's not as linear as the process of selling a product, for example, because there's a lot of different layers to the consideration set when you're asking someone to come work for you. So the stories are more human in nature, obviously. Typically, the messaging that we put out is culture-based, which is a lot of marketers would say it's softer, but it's harder. I mean, those messages are harder because how that resonates with somebody, when you're selling a product, it's, hey, is there a use for this product and can I solve your problem?
Yeah.
When we're talking about, do you want to come work at this company? There is an endless list of reasons why someone may or may not. So you're trying to cover a lot of ground with your messages and your content. And that really requires you to get super targeted and do a lot of persona work, which I wasn't quite expecting coming from a more brand and marketing background. But a lot of the basics of that we apply to the candidate audience. And you just have to be really targeted because what they care about, like their reasons to believe, are so robust.
Yeah, I mean, it's different when you're selling a latte versus someone's livelihood, right?
That's exactly right.
The stakes are a little bit higher than buying a product. And so you have to, I would imagine, reach into those, softer sort of tactics to get them to understand why it's a great place to work and also why, your 401k is also really important. Like all those little like hard and soft things. So
That's right.
You can't just pull a lever to compete on a technical specification. Oh, right. Our competitor does X, we do Y. We do this better. We do this 10% better. So you can't use that sales tactic. You're selling why you do something.
That's right.
Like your point, the culture around things, all those benefits. And I think probably for you guys right now, the biggest thing you're probably seeing in the market is what people wanting remote work, right? People wanting flexibility and schedule.
Yep, that's right. And I think, when we're talking about selling a product, You don't have to worry about authenticity as much because the product either works or it doesn't, right? It either solves the problem or it doesn't. When we're talking about employer brand, we have to be very careful about the stories that we're telling, because if those are not authentic and someone joins our company, we're not going to be able to retain them. And then we have to fill them again and the cycle starts all over. So we have to be, the problem that we're solving is not as black and white as it is when you're selling a product.
Yeah. And how has that sort of changed, like everyone sort of wanting remote work and you being able to hire anyone everywhere? How has that changed how you market the companies that you've worked for in the past? Like, how does that even impact the day-to-day, offer, like the salary and everything like that?
Yeah. So in some ways it's made it easier, I think. And in a lot of ways it's made it more challenging. It's certainly made it more competitive, right? Because you have your business competitive set. Like these are the people who compete with us with our products. And then you have your talent competitive set, which is these are the people who we're competing for talent with. Typically those are larger companies than your business competitor set, especially if we're talking about engineering and tech talent, right? You've got the Facebooks, the Googles of the world who are gobbling up talent because they can pay them exorbitant amounts of money that a lot of companies can't and won't and shouldn't. Right. So it becomes harder in the sense of how do you compete and what do those differentiators look like? A lot of companies have historically, from an employer brand perspective, relied on the culture story and that being the differentiator. Well, when everybody's remote or hybrid, the culture story becomes a little more of a level playing field. You have to reestablish what culture means when half of your workforce is remote, if not more. So there's a lot of kind of retooling the narrative that's happening with a lot of companies and employer brand. But then what ends up happening is you see a lot of companies start saying the same things. They're they're doubling down on this idea of remote work. And it's become a candidate expectation, quite frankly. If you are trying to recruit somebody or from an employer brand perspective and you say, hey, you've got to come in the office, a lot of people just won't even look. So it's becoming that flexibility is becoming non-negotiable anymore. And so that really changes when we're talking about our messaging platform, what we're leading with, what's like table stakes versus what's differentiating.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's so interesting, Ashlee. But my thought was like a lot of people with the Great Resignation. I know you've heard that, especially in the HR world. A lot of my friends who are looking for jobs right now, when they talk to me, like, they had a great interview, it's so great. They said the job was remote, and then they talk about maybe can you come in like 1-2 days a week? And then it sort of changes the conversation. So I've had a lot of people who have gotten really far down the path and then had to decline a job offer because they're like, I'm not gonna move. I'm not gonna come in.
Yeah,
and so
that's right. And that's that authenticity piece,
exactly.
Right? That's that authenticity piece. Like if we're going to tell you that we are a remote first workforce or hybrid workforce, you'll hear it talked about a bunch of different ways depending on the company. Candidates are asking those questions, right? Well, what does that mean? Is that forever? Is that right now? And what does that look like a year from now? And we have to be authentic, whether that is, yes, you're be remote for now or for always. We have to tell both of those stories because it's not realistic for a lot of companies that everybody's going to go 100% remote till the end of time. There's a lot of business decisions that come into that, least of all compensation, quite frankly. Like there's a lot of pieces to that. And so we really have to think about when we're telling the story of what it looks like to work at a company right now, what does it actually look like? And how does that change dependent on the role? And we have to get really targeted with that content.
Yeah. So besides like the future of work and how people are working in this environment, a lot of people are making their selection not only by, oh, I get remote work or I get a hybrid role, but is this company cool? Like, is this on the list of companies that are fun to work at? Do they tick all the boxes of, the diversity requirements, the environmental requirements? Like basically, do I want to be associated with this brand long term? Right. So it's probably a lot of what you do instead of, again, selling a product is hitting on those points so people can say, you know what, that is a place I want to be. That is somewhere I want to be associated with. And in 3, 5, 10 years, when I'm on to my next role, I want to have that saying I came from there and I helped.
That's right. That's exactly right, Derek, especially when we're talking about technical talent, especially when we're talking about engineering talent, because they have typically they have a list of companies they love the product of, and they want to work on the product. They want to work on cool stuff, right? They want to build cool stuff. And so a lot of what we're working on now is how do we tell those stories about what it's like to work on products at companies. And this is something I've worked on at every company I've worked in employer brand on, in a way that's authentic, but also in a way that's exciting, because that's what cuts through the clutter right now. If we're saying that culture is table stakes in a lot of companies, and especially when we're talking about technical companies, a lot of them are doing a lot of the same things. There's some differentiators, but it's getting harder to differentiate in that space. We're saying that compensation is more competitive depending on the market. And there are some markets companies compete in, and there are some markets that companies just say, I'm not going to compete in the Bay Area, so I'm going to stop, right?
Sure.
It just kind of depends on the company and where you're focused. So we're saying that all of these things, they kind of rack and stack differently depending on who you're talking to. And we're talking about a technical audience. One of the number one things for them is this a cool, fun product that I can actually grow with and I can iterate on and I can like put in my portfolio and people will understand what I've built. They don't want to work on kind of archaic, more dinosaur tech. They want to work on the fun stuff. And who can blame them for that? I mean, I think we all want to work on the fun stuff. So that's definitely part of it.
And you can't get bait and switch. Like you mentioned
Right.
authenticity earlier.
Right.
Like my very first role out of school, I was like, I'm going to get to work in automotive. I'm going to work on race cars. It's going to be awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get your badge and you sit down in your seat and your role is, I need you to make sure that none of these bolts have hexavalent chromium in them. Right. So like
it's the dream. The dream
Yeah.
you always thought you'd live.
Yeah,
I was building
wasn't-
cars.
It wasn't what I expected. We ended up having
Yes.
to go do our own thing, but it was
Yeah.
it was a complete bait and switch. Like you're so excited, you get into this role, you get the cool badge at the company you wanted to work at, and then you're sorting bolts, right? That's
Yeah.
So
Go ahead, Lauren.
it sounds like you have a lot to consider, especially now that, the world looks a lot different than it did a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And you said something that I thought was interesting, where it's like some companies may decide like they can't compete with folks who are recruiting or looking for people to work in the Bay. So, as someone who works in employer brand, how are you using data to kind of make those decisions about where you want to promote your company and maybe where you don't?
Yeah. So data and employer brand is a really interesting topic because I think it is a gray area for a lot of companies right now. Most people I talk to in the employer brand space, people I've worked with, people I just know in the industry, are all struggling with how do we firm up our data around employer brand? Because there's kind of two sets of data, right? There's what we talk about, which is your traditional marketing data. Because in employer brand, most of your delivery channels are what I would consider traditional marketing channels, your social media, your career site, drip email, that type of thing. So we can measure engagement, awareness, all the traditional metrics on that all day long to really test how efficient and impactful our content is. But then you have a whole another set of data, which is typically owned by a people analytics or a people data team that's really around things like time to fill, cost to fill, how are we closing, and what markets are we closing quickly, and in what markets do we have a higher number of declines at the offer stage. That's the type of data that I want to tap into to understand exactly what you're talking about, Lauren, because if we know I'm going to make this up, in Chicago or in Illinois, we only have a 20% close rate at offer stage because we just aren't able to compete with what they have competitively, then we have to make a business decision, first of all. And that's something that will really come from our recruiting partners is, do we need to double down? Like, is there something we can do? Or do we just leave that alone and go to a market where we know, like North Carolina, making this up too, we close at 80%. So let's go see if that talent, if we can mine more talent out of that state. That's, globally too, regionally, we have to think about that.
So that's just like a product, right? It's like a complete funnel of like real true metrics of this is how many people we touched. This is how many people we got to interview. This is how many people we got to the stage. This is how we closed. And this is how we grew.
That's right.
Yeah. So
I was going to say, how does it work when, you have a 20%, for instance, 20% close rate in a certain city? Is it traditional for most companies to say, like, once they don't, let's say a applicant declines an offer, how does that work? Do you guys, do companies typically track why they didn't close and then that's reported out to employer brand? Or how have you seen that process work in the past?
I've seen it work a couple of different ways. So yes, some companies track that and most of it's manual, right? Where you go in, they say decline X, Y, and Z comp or whatever competitive offer. And some don't. Some just care about whether it was an acceptance or a decline. For me, understanding the why is super important because, something we hear a lot from stakeholders, and I've heard this since day one working in employer brand, is we can't hire in this market. We need more awareness. And so then I have to start asking questions, because is it a pipeline? If it's a pipeline issue, then sure, I would say maybe it's an awareness issue. But if the pipeline is full and we're not closing, then I want to know why we're not closing. Because if we're not closing because of comp, if we're not closing because, a big tech company is just gobbling up the talent, that's nothing that employer brand is going to be able to impact. So that's where we really get into having to understand and ask questions about what the data is on the recruiting side or the HR side to help us inform our decisions, because employer brand is not the end all be all, right? We're really talking top of funnel when we're talking about employer brand. So we have to be really careful about what we tie ourselves to in terms of metrics.
And that helps you, like you mentioned earlier, it's like that really helps you focus on, if we're going to be comp constrained, where we can actually focus to be successful, where we can put, if we have $1 of effort, what's our return on that effort? Right?
That's right. Right. And you're seeing all companies right now really looking at their comp, and everybody is stepping it up. I mean, that's part of this great resignation that you're talking about, Lauren, right? People are leaving for a significant amount of money than they would have left for a year ago, and probably will more than they will leave for in a year or two from now. This is just a peak point right now. And so every company is stepping up their game, but there's also just at some point, your loss in that becomes too great, and you have to start thinking about, okay, what kind of new bars are we setting for ourselves here, and how do we kind of settle that out a little bit?
In our world, it's tough because like the competitive grab for people that are AI talent, that know machine learning, that can do that kind of analytics, that are DevOps, that can do microservices architecture, that know security, like that skill set. It's like you are paying for that skill set. There's no like, I can get someone that kind of knows that and get it cheap. Like you are bringing a checkbook, or else they're going to go to one of the other companies, right?
Right. Because you're talking a little bit about a unicorn, right? In terms of talent, there's not that many of them. And I think we're also seeing a shift to companies, not just in the tech space, but really thinking about, okay, if I can't go unicorn hunting, right? Like I can't do that all the time. I can't just bring in these people with very specific talent because everybody wants them. Do I need to shift my model and really lean more into kind of development and bring talent in earlier, talent who has parallel skill set, train them in what I need to, and grow them that way. So you're seeing kind of a whole different shift in how we're talking about talent and the types of talent that we're looking for. It's not as specific in some cases anymore.
So on that point, this might be out of the bounds of what you do on a day-to-day basis, but continued talent development with all the new online platforms, with so much university work being online, do you see more and more of your workforce continuing to develop with online schooling more than you have in the past, or is it about the same?
I don't know specifically about online schooling. What I can tell you is growth and development within a company is really climbing the ranks in terms of what candidates care about. It's a question they ask a lot. What kind of growth and development do you have? What is your performance review process? What are the programs you have in place to help me grow and stay? Candidates don't necessarily want to jump around. I think I think in some cases is true, but I think it's also kind of a falsehood in a lot of ways. They want to grow and stay somewhere that they're well compensated and well rewarded, and there's opportunities for growth. But in terms of our message platform and past several years, growth and development is one that is becoming more and more important because people care a lot more about it than maybe they would have 5 years ago.
Yeah, sure. And I think a lot of places don't do it exceptionally well, right?
Agree.
They hire someone for a role and they're like, I can use that puzzle piece to squeeze that role until they leave and I have to replace them, versus I need to hire this person because I see these leadership attributes in this person and they can be a team leader to do X, Y, and Z in the future. I don't think enough people do that.
I also think it's ironic because I've heard from so many HR executives that, it's actually very expensive to acquire. And just like you in marketing, like it's more expensive to acquire a new customer than it is to retain an existing one.
That's right.
And we know that about marketing, but we don't really apply that to employees. And I've been seeing this on LinkedIn quite a bit. It's like that we're in this great resignation right now. We're seeing employers kind of throw themselves at prospective employees while sort of forgetting the fact that the current employees have been kind of keeping the wheels on the bus during an insane, couple years without as much recognition. And so
that's right.
I would imagine it's super important, like even for an employer brand, but like keeping your existing employees happy
Mhm.
while you're trying to get those new ones. So when you bring in those new employees, you're bringing them into like a healthy and happy
That's right.
culture.
That's right. And I think that's a great point. And I think we're seeing more employer brand professionals start talking about retention, where
Yeah.
historically employer brand is really about talent attraction, right? Get them in top
Mhm.
of funnel, get them to the apply stage, and then recruiters kind of take it from there and run them through that process is high level how it's typically worked. We're starting to really think about it from a candidate journey perspective, which is very similar to a user journey, right? Like when
Yeah.
do they interact with your brand? A lot of times that's corporate brand. It's not employer brand, right? Most
Right.
people know your company because of what they see from corporate brand. Then it's, they might go to your careers page or whatever the employer brand input is. And then it has to be compelling content. We measure all that through marketing metrics. And then they get pushed through a candidate journey. And typical candidate journeys have historically stopped at onboard stage. But now we're seeing, how do we loop that back around to the associate experience to retain them? Because if we don't retain them, to your point, the cycle starts all over, and that's really expensive than it
Yeah.
is to retain. But then that puts a whole different light on things like comp and ben of your current employees, and how do they
Mhm.
feel rewarded, and how do they feel their growth is prioritized. And that's the stuff that shows up on Glassdoor. That's the stuff that
Which
shows
impacts
up on
employer
Google
brands.
reviews, which circles all the way back to me. And then we have
Mhm.
to really mitigate that. So everything on an employer brand perspective, people kind of put it over here in a silo. And I think maybe for a while that was okay, but everything is becoming connected now. And so everything that we do from an employer brand perspective is either proactive or it's reactive to the back end of that candidate journey.
You mentioned silo. So again, like we see all the time, you have companies that are siloed in their individual disciplines, and then the data stays siloed. But with
Sure.
you needing to be so tightly tied with the corporate brand, do you work with your Marcom, the brand Marcom teams in this space? Like in general, do you see the HR teams now working with the Marcom teams, working with the product marketing teams to have like a unified message to the market, or is it still pretty siloed?
I would say that's best practice. I've seen it work really well, and I've seen it where it doesn't, where it's not set up that way. Yeah, I think employer brand is really the bridge between corporate brand and recruiting, because
Yeah.
we have a foot in both. And so I think we have to figure out, how are we the bridge to that data, and how do we connect that? I think some companies are further ahead in that journey than others. There are professionals in the space I talk to where they've figured it out for them, and there's others that are like, I don't know. I mean, it's hard. It's hard to do. It's a lot of gray areas. The platforms don't talk to each other. We're talking about very different tech stacks, sometimes 3 different tech stacks, right? Corporate brand, employer brand, recruiting. And they don't talk to each other. So you're having to do a lot of kind of
Manual.
a manual connection. I would say most of it is dotted line. It's correlated, not causal. A lot of the data that we're looking at, and we have to kind of make some assumptions based on that. And we do, and we've gotten good at that. But I think there's this overwhelming desire to, how do we firm that up, and what does that look like?
Yeah, like
I can.
Nirvana would be all that data collects together. You can get
Yeah.
good, clean insights across what you need to do, and then even have recommendations coming out of that as what are good next steps to try as an entire holistic organization to get good results for your product, for your brand, and for your
That's right.
recruiting efforts.
That's right.
Yeah, I would. You've worked at a bunch of different companies, and I think, just I know from personal experience, that you're an amazing communicator, and I think you work really well across function. What advice would you give to somebody maybe in your position who's trying to work with corporate marketing, trying to work, with recruiting to get all of this information, and sort of start those conversations?
Yeah.
What would you recommend?
Yeah, that's a great question. People have asked me before, like, how hard has the transition been from agency to going in-house? It's not been as hard as I thought it would. And honestly, the number one benefit from being in the agency space is stakeholder management.
Yeah.
Because you've dealt with clients for years, you know how to communicate with other stakeholders. So we're talking about something like this, where you have data a bunch of different places. You have people who aren't approaching a problem from the same place. They have very different motivations. Number one is really lean into stakeholder management, build those relationships, and listen. Like, you have to listen. You have to understand brand marketing has completely different goals than what employer brand is going to have. Recruiting certainly does. So we have to find the common ground between those pieces. And for me, someone who's not been in the space for too terribly long, the best approach has just been, I listen, I ask a ton of questions, and I really lean into that stakeholder management piece. Because without that, you're never it's a collective effort. It's never going to be one of us is not going to have the solution. We have to build it together.
I mean, I think that's a really good point, because I started in the agency side too. Mm-hmm. Then I started working in the corporate world. And in my last role as a marketing director, we had data people, we had customer service people, we had folks who were doing traditional marketing, mm-hmm. content development, and they were all sort of just doing their own thing.
Yep.
And so when I first started working there, I made it a point to meet customer service and then also talk to the data guy, who actually mm-hmm. became one of my biggest confidants in that job, just because you can't really do marketing, especially for an e-commerce business, without knowing what the data is telling you. Mm-hmm. And so I think you're right. Like being able to ask the right questions, talk to people maybe who are not in your direct circle, and just listen. It's a super important task. And I think in the agency space, the stakes feel higher when you're trying to like manage clients and stuff than it does when you work on the corporate side, because there's a retainer at stake.
Yes.
And it's
your hourly rate and you got to move through it fast. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think it prepares you pretty well for working cross-function and being able to listen and broker those conversations. So it's great.
Totally agree. And I think too, what's really refreshing is because I think employer brand is kind of having this moment right now. Yeah. I mean, if you look on LinkedIn, there are a ton of employer brand jobs that are open right now, way more than a year or two ago. Companies are really starting to understand the value of it when it's done well and when it is connected to some of these other functions. And so I've had good experience with, the company wants to connect all these things. It's really hard to do. And it's a totally new build in a lot of cases. It's connecting things that have never been connected before. So it's hard and it takes time. And so it's not just a matter of connecting and asking the right questions and kind of building that relationship. It's also a matter of like time and resources and budget to do that. Yeah. And how do you kind of work together to figure out what makes sense for the company?
And a lot of people that haven't done it before will be like, oh, it's easy. You just use the APIs and you stick it together. And it's like,
that's right.
Not so fast, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a whole data equity thing. You have to be able to connect those things. You have to be able to make sure the databases line up properly, that you're not duplicating data. Yep. It's really a lot messier than people think. Oh, it's an API. You just stick it together. No big deal.
That's right.
$3 million and 2 years later, you might still be in a rough spot.
Yep.
But you mentioned, sorry.
No, go ahead.
You mentioned corporate brand like the HR department and the branding of like in recruiting is really having its moment right now. Mm-hmm. And I think we're seeing this space where companies are still focused on product and services, but anything human centric is just brought right to the top.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yep, for sure. And I think especially when we start to layer in diversity and inclusion and how that impacts not just culture, but customer relationships and how that's being threaded into the day-to-day business of an organization. Diversity and inclusion oftentimes is a separate entity from employer brand, but that is another huge stakeholder for us, right? Because diversity and inclusion needs to be woven into all of the stories that we're telling. A lot of times you'll hear stakeholders will ask me, for example, what are we doing to hire diverse candidates? Like, what are our diversity and inclusion projects? And my stance on it is they're all diversity and inclusion projects. We don't have projects and then diversity and inclusion employer brand projects. We are committed as a company to bringing in the most diverse talent that we can. And that has to thread through to everything that we do. And measuring that is different because there are a lot of compliance things that you have to consider when we're talking about how we're measuring diversity. So that's another whole data set that really layers in here too. So you can start to see kind of, there's a lot of layers to the onion in terms of how to connect this stuff.
And anytime you're doing anything that's strategic problem solving, the more voices you have in a space that can contribute safely to that problem, the better outcomes you're going to get, right? Because
I agree.
They will see a problem from a different angle. They will have a different level of experience. They might have a different clever idea that other people in the room may not have even thought of or considered or experienced, which leads to overall a better outcome and decision.
That's right. I totally agree. And so much of that, in my experience, is the leadership of those functions, because that is such a top-down mindset, right? Having that freedom and that safety to ask those questions, to poke holes in things, and to have a common outcome you're building towards together, especially when we're talking about not only different stakeholder groups, but we're dealing with people, right? I mean, we're communicating to humans, and there's a sensitivity level in that. And we all have to be mindful of that when we're trying to create strategies and content.
One of the places we came from, it was kind of loudest voice wins in its early days, right? And it was tough because you'd end up in these situations where you'd have a lot of really good ideas that would just stop getting contributed. And we were working with an oil and gas company, and they were trying to completely reverse that, right? If they were in a high level executive meeting and you had a really powerful personality, and then you had maybe a harmony team building person that was a little bit quieter, they wanted this voice to be able to be heard, to not be afraid or pushed out of their comfort zone by this voice. And that was a big thing for them, right? Because over time, this voice, the team building harmony voice, just mutes itself out, self-selects to mute themselves out. And that stinks because you lose so many good ideas, so many good outcomes just kind of fall away.
Yeah, I totally agree. And those are the types of questions that candidates are asking right now. You know, we work really closely, EB works really closely with recruiters, kind of what's the boots on the ground stuff? Like, what are you hearing from candidates? And they're asking those questions. How do decisions get made at your company? What does the strategic planning process look like? Really specific questions that I would say 2 years ago weren't being asked because the market is so competitive. They can be that specific. They can ask those questions because they're probably especially in the tech space, they're talking to multiple people and they know they're desirable. So they can ask these really specific questions to make sure it's a good fit for them too.
It's like the housing market. These people have multiple offers, right?
That's right.
They get to pick.
That's right. You better come over, ask. You better have no due diligence. You better have a 30-day close.
No inspection. Oh my gosh. It's a nightmare.
Yeah.
I think the reason that I think alpha culture sort of had its heyday for a moment where it's like we built up and propped up the folks who were the loudest in the room, especially when like startup and entrepreneurship became like buzzwords. And so it really was the loudest person in the meeting, the most aggressive person in the meeting got the most airtime. But I do think the pendulum is swinging back the other way, where there's a balance of somebody like maybe not acknowledging someone who has been more quiet and to try to bring them out of their shell and like make it a safer space to have those communications. So I think it went really hard the other direction. And now we're sort of coming back to hopefully a middle ground where it's, you know, you can have those honest and maybe like intense conversations, but not to the point where you're shutting people down and making people feel scared.
Intel does a really good job about that. Like Intel kind of pioneered the disagree and commit. So they go around the room, make sure you share. Everyone gets a chance to share and no one gets their idea judged negatively or positively. And you have ultimately a decision maker who gets to stamp the team's decision, right? And then it's once you go, wait, this is what we're going to do. You go around the room again. Are you committed? Are you committed? Are you committed? And if you disagree, you are encouraged to say, you know what, I disagree, but I'm committed to the success of the project. And that's created an opportunity where it's safe to communicate, where your voice doesn't get muted out, it doesn't get judged. And even if you don't go that direction or people don't pick your idea, you got heard and no one judged it negatively and you got to contribute to the outcome, which is great.
Well, and this is the type of thing that makes my job really difficult because exactly what you're talking about, how do you communicate that in a piece of content? In a way that's authentic, right? How do you, because those are the differentiators of a company. It's typically not benefits, although there's some companies that are doing some progressive things in that space, but it's not that type of stuff anymore, right? It's people are kind of offering similar packages. It's what you're talking about is the experiential piece that is the differentiator. And how do you talk about that in a way that feels authentic, doesn't feel shticky, doesn't feel like you're just pushing a marketing video out? It's really hard.
It's so funny that you say that because I think a lot of people or a lot of brands try to wrap that around culture. And it's such an eye roll moment for prospective employees. They're like, oh, culture. Yeah. You have a great culture. We get it. But to Derek's point, like that is a very unique aspect of a company's culture. And it's like, how do you put that in a non-corny video that does feel authentic and it is experiential? And, you know, when we worked at a lighting company, what we always thought was interesting was that you could say that light was better, but you didn't really know that you were living under crappy light until you saw and experienced the opposite.
Sure.
But you can't go into everybody's home and unscrew their old light bulb and put in a new one and be like, see how much better it is?
That's right.
So it was trying, and then it was like, we spent a lot of time trying to create these unique marketing pieces, and it's very hard to convey in a produced piece that you have an authentic culture. It's sort of at odds.
That's right.
It's the Febreze problem, right? If you're familiar with that story, like the reason Febreze didn't get traction is because their target market didn't realize their spaces smelled terrible. Right? They became nose deaf to it. So they had to think about how do you reimagine that experiential piece when you can't show somebody in a piece of content what that before and after is, right? You can't illustrate smell through video.
Yep. And what you were talking about, Lauren, is the driver behind targeted content, because the example that you gave, Derek, about Intel, that's going to resonate with some people more than it resonates with others based on what we know about how they make decisions, right? Just as you would when they buy a product, different categories, different target profiles, their consideration set is different when they're talking about joining a new company. There are some people who I'm going to take like getting a house, I'm going to take the highest offer. I don't care about the contingencies. I'm just going to take it. There are other people who care a lot about what we're talking about. What is my day-to-day experience like? What does diversity look like at this company? How does that infuse into my day-to-day? So we have to get very targeted with who we're talking to and create content that aligns with what we think we know about what they're experiencing. And we do, we can do surveying. There's some companies who just do employer brand surveying to help us kind of understand some of that behind those markets, but it's still kind of nebulous. You're making your best guess about what somebody's going to resonate with or what's going to resonate with somebody else.
And you're trying to convince somebody to make maybe the single largest decision they make in their life, right?
That's
it's like
right.
You are going to spend 8 to 10 hours a day here, 5 to 6 days a week with this group of people. And this gets to dictate your happiness and misery in your other part of your world, right? Like I think I've been at roles where the culture there impacted me to the point where my personal life, it's spilled into my personal life, and my personal relationships are there. So it's a huge decision you get to make, and you have that's a tough job. It's a tough role to be able to communicate that concisely to get the right talent in.
And I would say sometimes it's done really well, and sometimes you miss the mark. It just depends on the day, really. And the market right now, the talent market is shifting so quickly that it's just becoming more and more competitive. And so our stakeholders are leaning on employer brand to really step up and help kind of break through that clutter. Historically, I think employer brand was an awareness play and was really super top of funnel and like, hey, we just need to know that this place is a great place to work. Once you've hit a certain level of awareness around that, like once your company is considered a great place to work by its peers, then we're shifting to supporting conversion. And that is even harder. And that is where data really becomes important to our earlier part of the conversation, where we're talking about what type of recruiting metrics do we need to try to tie into? Is it cost per lead? Is it cost per hire? Is it time to fill? Is it number of kind of passive candidates we got in the funnel? Like there's a lot of stuff that we can track, but what ultimately is the most important KPI or metric to follow that's going to prove that employer brand impacts the ultimate organizational goal, which is, I say it a lot, butts and seats at the end of the day. Like the organizational goal is to hire X percentage of talent growth 2, 3, 5 years out. If we don't support that, then we're not doing our job.
And then the long tail ramifications of that, of the people you pulled in with X campaign, what was their experience? Did they become leadership? Did they enjoy their role? Did they churn? So
that's a whole different level too, right? Like that's part of that, taking the candidate journey into the associate journey. And how do you actually map that back to, okay, well, back to our earlier example, we know that 80% of offers in North Carolina are accepted. Well, are they good talent? Like we might be able to get them, but how was their performance? Did they grow here? Are they poised for management? Then you get into a whole nother layer of like talent assessment, which we don't have anything to do with an employer brand, but circles back around to what we're doing when we're trying to make decisions about markets. Right.
Yeah.
So it's
you have
all
to be able
a
to
circle.
iterate and make sure that, back to what the goal is. If the objective is to get talent that can continue to grow, develop, become leadership, that impacts what you have to do as a team.
That's right.
And that's awesome. So what do you think the future looks like with all of this, where things are moving? What does the next 10 years look like in this space?
Yeah, I do think we're going to see a lot more automation. I think we're going to see these connections that we're talking about of employer brand connecting into, for simplification, recruiting data. I think we're going to see that get closer and closer and closer and closer. I think people um, people are understanding the great opportunity there. And I imagine we're going to start seeing some tools that are going to start doing some of the connection you were talking about earlier, Derek. How do we thread all these things together? I also think that you're going to see perhaps more of an alignment with employer brand and corporate brand at a lot of companies. Historically, those things have been very separate, but they're getting closer and closer together in terms of how candidates are entering the awareness space with companies. So I think we're going to start seeing a little more there too. I also think when we're talking about talent in general, we're going to see a plateau at some point. There's only so many people who can leave all at once. So I think we're going to start seeing a little bit of a plateau, but I do think we've raised the bar in terms of what we're offering people, and it's going to take a while for that to settle back down a little bit. But I think a lot of things are going to stay the same, right? When we're talking about what candidates are looking for, it doesn't vary that much. I think the order of things varies a little bit. And I do think employer brand is going to have to continue to get way more targeted and really figure out what data can help them do that, because it's becoming less of a volume game now. It's becoming more of a very specific exercise for the type of talent in what spaces, in what regions, for what teams on which products. It's becoming very specific. And that is a whole, that's a new world for a lot of people in employer brand. When the function started, it was, we got to fill pipeline, just fill it. And then we will screen it and source it on the back end. So it's different. And I think we're going to see a lot of more marketing and maybe tech-based marketers enter the employer brand space as we start to see some of that shift happen.
Yeah.
And it's not obvious, but a lot of the work you're doing and a lot of the requirements for the new workforce actually impacts commercial real estate downstream, right? It's like, as companies are shaping what that future looks like, what does the commercial landscape look like? How many square feet of building?
Do you need physical offices anymore? And for a lot of companies, that's probably not the case. All right. So I have two fun questions because we got to let you go at some point, although we can talk forever and ever. All right. So one of my favorite questions to ask would be, if you could have dinner with like an 18-year-old version of you, a 25-year-old version of you, what would you say? Like, what would you talk about? Would you give them any advice?
Like collectively, or like at 18 and 25? Because my answers might be different.
You pick an age that you would like to focus on, because you're right, that is a different age point.
I'll do 18. So when I was 18, I was ready to get out of Dodge. I was ready to get out of town. I think we all are, right? We finished school, ready to start something new. I played it safe. I went to a state school. I stayed close to home. I've always been close to home. If I could go back, and I would push myself to see other places, people, and things, and have different experiences and live in different communities, and to kind of absorb and learn from others a little bit more. I was scared. I was 18, your comfort levels are different. I'm 35 now. Life is different, but that's what I would do. I'd go back and say, take some risks, go overseas, go learn, because you learn so much just from absorbing in other spaces and things. So that's probably what I would say.
And I would just say, I think that's a really great answer, by the way. And I think, to your point, when you do travel and you see other places, it opens up your mind as to how other people live, but it also gives you an appreciation for your own life in a way that you don't have if you never leave that bubble. So I think
absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Last question is, all right, I know you and I are podcast listeners, but what's your favorite podcast right now? What would you recommend?
I actually just started listening to at least a new to me one. It's called Smart Less. Have you heard of this one?
No.
It's Will Arnett, Jason Bateman, and Sean Hayes. And they just they chit chat, but every episode, one of them brings a surprise guest, and they just kind of learn from that person. It's just, they're funny. It's light. I used to listen to a lot of professional development podcasts. And then I realized that really I want to spend that time light, learning things have nothing to do with my job, learning about different people. So that's kind of where I spend my time. But Smart Less, that's a good one I just got into.
That sounds fun, because it's a good balance between having interesting conversation and maybe a little brevity.
Yeah, exactly right. Yep. Yeah.
Derek, you got any questions? Any last minute questions for Ash over here?
No, I think we're good. I think we ran into extra innings, which is awesome, and we could
Yeah,
probably
no
keep going if we
worries.
wanted to.
Yeah,
But no,
for
we
sure.
really, really appreciate you taking the time. It was a lot of fun talking through this. Again, the
Yeah.
space, anything human centric, and in this space, it's the fastest growing area, like health,
Hmm.
wellness, the HR world. That's where
Hmm.
most of the investments going in businesses now, and even venture
Yeah,
capital investments.
that's
So
right.
it's really fun to talk about the space, hear what you're working on, and we really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, it's always good to see you guys. Thanks for having me. I could talk about this for hours. So to me, we kept it short. So
We
that's
did our
awesome.
best.
We did our best. All right.
Awesome.
Well, thanks. It's so good to see you guys.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Ashlee.
Ashlee.
All right. See you later.